The RTX 2060 Super came out in July of 2019, which is about 5 years ago, and it's still a relatively popular GPU on the Steam hardware survey. It comes in at, if you're excluding integrated graphics and laptop graphics, dedicated GPUs only, it's in 17th place. Its younger brother, the 2060, is in 5th place. So these are still very popular GPUs. And when we get through, you're going to see some results of the games and you're going to understand why people still play them, because they are still great GPUs at 1080p gaming to get relatively decent frame rates even in new games. So one of the main things that really allows this GPU to still shine 5 years later is that it has 8 gigabytes of VRAM, which is very important because there's a lot of modern games that at 1080p without ray tracing and all that are using close to that 8 gigabyte mark. So that really helps this GPU to compete. If it only had 4 gigabytes, it would really start to struggle. So really what, besides having 8 gigabytes of RAM, it also has a fairly large memory bus. Each gigabyte of RAM has its own lane at 32 bits. That gives this 256-bit memory bus lane with a bandwidth of 448 gigabytes. Now, compare that to the 4060. It only has a 128-bit lane. So every 2 gigabytes only has one 32-bit lane, which gives it a relatively small bandwidth of 272 gigabits per second. So that extra bandwidth definitely helps out the 2060 Super to compete 5 years down the road. So we're going to take a look and see how the 2060 Super has fared over the past 5 years. We're going to test it in a bunch of different games starting in 2019 and 2018 when the GPU first came out, all the way up to some of the more current gen games. Now, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below, and I'd really appreciate it if you would join the channel and like the video. Starting off with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we're going to be testing in 1080p. So we got any of the upscalers turned off, desync turned off, and graphics, we are going to put them at the highest and have any kind of ray tracing turned off as well. So we are currently here in some sort of dungeon, and the GPU's having no problem playing this game. It's actually getting fairly high FPS. The average is 112, and the 1% low is 84, so it's definitely not struggling whatsoever to play this game. The 2060 actually could probably handle this quite easily at 1440p, even 4K. But we're just going to stick to 1080p gaming for the moment. So this game came out in 2018, I believe, about a year before, or maybe a half year to a year before the GPU was released. And I'm not surprised that it has handling the game. I'm actually surprised it's getting such high frame rates, but it's still pretty decent.
What do we have here?
Well, I don't think we need to do too much more in this game because it has no problem handling a game that came out around the same time frame as the GPU. One of the most popular games that came out in this time frame is Red Dead Redemption 2. So we're going to give this a test at 1080p, VSync's off, quality preset is at max, everything's at max, DLSS is off, FSR is off. Now, this is the Super version, it's 2060 Super, and we're not even hitting an average of 60 FPS. For the amount that these cards cost, I would expect a 2060 or a 3060 or 4060 in the time that it came out to at least hit 60 FPS on average for the games of that era. Like the amount you're spending on these GPUs, I don't think 60 FPS is a far stretch. And now this is the Super variant, and we're not even hitting the 60 FPS mark. We're getting close. We're at 49 FPS. And the 1% low is at 41 FPS. So it's not doing terrible, but just the expectation when you're dishing out $400 for a graphics card, it should hit the 60 FPS in 1080p. So this kind of doesn't bode well for other AAA games that we're going to test. Hopefully they can still keep up, but we will see. Anyway, let's just give it a run around here and see if anything else changes depending on the scenario or the scenery that we're moving through. So in this landscape type of scene, it's actually pushing the average FPS lower than what we were seeing earlier. The current FPS is sitting in the mid to low 40s, where the average has been 47. So yeah, different scenes and scenarios in the game are definitely going to be hit a little bit different. But it's still, 44 is still decent enough, and you can easily turn on DLSS to get an extra few FPS, or you can turn the graphics down. But again, I was expecting better for a $400 graphics card that came out at this time. So the last game that we're going to test that came out from back in that day, the 2018-2019 timeframe, is Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. And then after this, we're going to move on to some more current gen games. So again, 1080p, no resolution scaling. Graphics are on Epic. So my goal is to run all these games on the highest setting possible, just so we can later on compare the performance from this video onto like a 3060 or 4060 later on. So yeah, after just being on here for not very long, we are getting an average of 131 FPS and a 1% low of 66. I'm kind of surprised that the 1% low is so low, but that's half of the average FPS. But it's still, I guess this game isn't as demanding as I was expecting. We're getting really high FPS at 132 and the 1% low at 66. Let's go move on to another area and see how we do there.
There.
So after roaming around it a bit and then coming into this vault, you can see the FPS has dropped from just being outside roaming around on the cliff sides. The 1% low is still relatively the same as 63 FPS. So the main takeaway is that back in 2018, 2019, this GPU still did very good. It didn't perform overly well in Red Dead Redemption 2, but Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Jedi Fallen Order, it's still doing very high FPS that you can easily play this game in 1440p and probably 4K. Let's move on to some newer games now. So Forza Motorsport came out towards the end of 2023, and when I test this game, it usually gets one of the highest FPS out of all the games that I've tested that came out within 2023 and 2024. So I'm assuming the 2060 Super will do fairly well on this game as well. 1080p, resolution scaling. We'll put on render quality as high. Oh. Put down to low. Well, I definitely was expecting to get a higher FPS than 49 out of this game. However, honestly, that's the same FPS that we're getting out of Red Dead Redemption 2. And then we also have the 1% low at 40, which, again, very playable at these frame rates. So again, this is a game that came out 4 years after the 2060 Super came out, and it's still able to run it fairly smoothly. And there's a lot of ways that you can increase the FPS by easily turning down the quality, using some kind of upscaler. We're still maintaining pretty much the same FPS, the 51 average and 41 1% low. So it might change depending on the track and the weather, because it's pretty rainy right now on this track, but you probably end up with the same or similar FPS. So a modern game that 2060 Super really doesn't have any problem playing. So we tried out Jedi Fallen Order, so let's see how this GPU does 4 years later with Jedi Survivor. So 1080p, and let's move graphic quality up to epic. VSync off, ray tracing's off, and any kind of upscaler is disabled. So ironically, both Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor use Unreal Engine 4. However, Jedi Survivor, as you can see, is a lot more demanding. We're hitting an average FPS of 41 and a 1% low of 30. So it is struggling to perform on this game. However, this is still completely playable with the 2060 Super. Again, you just have to tone down the graphics a little bit, the detail, and use an upscaler, and if you want to, and you would be able to get fairly high FPS, but you wouldn't have any trouble playing it with a 41 average and 1% low of 30. We did have a couple of spikes there, but it's really not showing through to the game. I didn't really feel any hiccups while I was moving around. Coming into this little city, whatever you want to call it, we're still averaging around that 41 FPS. So not amazing performance, but in all honesty, the performance is good enough. Again, you can pick the 2060 Super up for probably under 150 US dollars. But with all the games I test, Starfield is the one that taxes the GPU the most. So let's see here. 1080p. Everything else is going to be on ultra or high. No VSync. Turn off. Turn NVIDIA low latency on. And this is what I expected. So we are averaging 33 FPS with a 1% low of 29. Whenever I test a GPU for performance on Starfield, I just do this loop in the city, because the city is the most demanding part of the game. Yeah, even our current FPS is starting to drop below the 30 FPS mark. Yeah, not the smoothest gameplay with the 2060 Super. Again, I don't know why Starfield is so demanding, but it definitely eats GPUs. Yeah, the best way to get a reasonable performance out of Starfield is to turn down the settings and turn on DLSS. Let's go and give that a try here after we're done this little loop. We're going to turn DLSS quality on. Let's just turn the presets down to high. I don't know if I would say much better, but it is getting a little bit better. I always like to have at least the 1% low sitting above 30 FPS. Not seeing any large spikes in the frame time graph, which is nice. So we're averaging 41 FPS and a 1% low of 33. So unfortunately, for rasterized performance, it's not able to keep up with Starfield. But once you turn on the upscaling, you get a fairly decent FPS in this game. And honestly, this is pretty much what I was expecting to get. Right, so we're going to move on to Cyberpunk 2077, and we're going to use the internal benchmark because we're going to try out not just rasterized performance, but we're going to try out ray tracing and upscaling. So again, 1080p. We'll turn DLSS off for now. Turn ray tracing off. We'll leave everything else on either high or ultra preset. So in the benchmark, not too bad. We got an average of 53 with a 1% low of 46. This is definitely a playable FPS. There's no major frame time spikes or anything like that. We had a little bit of a blip there as we changed scenes. Outside, we're still performing fairly well. Yeah, so for the most part, this game, I can see why the 2060 Super is still fairly popular because it's still doing extremely well in most games. So let's go and turn ray tracing on, and you can see how bad it actually starts to perform. Turn that on, everything on, and we'll turn the ray trace lighting on to medium, and everything else will keep off. And I'm assuming it's coming through on the recording that is very choppy. Just look at the frame time graph, there's a couple of big dips. But you're not going to play a game with an average of 19 FPS and a 1% low of 15. After we're done this, we'll give DLS a try with this on, and hopefully it can recover from such poor performance with the ray tracing on. Could we get out of this earlier? Nope, I'm stuck watching it till the end. So yeah, there's nothing that's going to happen from here till the end that is going to help boost the FPS. This is unplayable at this rate. All right, let's turn DLSS on. Let's go with balanced. Yeah, really, even with DLSS on balanced, we're not getting the greatest performance. We are hitting like the 30 FPS average, but the 1% low is 21. The frame time graph definitely is not smooth. And in my opinion, it's not worth sacrificing the performance to get ray tracing at this level. If you want to game with ray tracing, you definitely need to buy a better GPU. Not even sure if a 4060 would be enough. But yeah, this is, you definitely want to only use rasterized performance while playing Cyberpunk 2077 unless you want to really jack up DLSS and turn down the quality quite a bit. So Avatar Frontiers of Pandora is the newest game that I have. It came out earlier in 2024. Tested out at 1080p. Turn DLSS off. Put it on the highest setting. I am going to turn the shadow quality, put it on low. Right. Apply the settings. Yeah, it's struggling with the 1% low on this game. There's quite a few spikes there. The average isn't half bad at 41 FPS. Still getting fairly similar performance in this scene. Average of 42 with the 1% low of 22. But definitely would consider turning down the graphics or turning DLSS on to get better performance, because as you can see, there's quite a few spikes. This scene's actually coming along a little bit better. We're maintaining a 1% low above 30 FPS, which is nice. But we are getting quite a few spikes. Let's just turn DLSS on and see what kind of performance we're going to get then. DLSS is on. Let's go with balanced. So the average FPS isn't doing much different than what we saw before. We're getting a 33, 32 average FPS, but the 1% low. That is maintaining a pretty solid 27 FPS. And with this scene, not too bad. We're nearing, well, 36 FPS on the average, and the 1% low, again, is a little bit higher at 29 FPS. And the frame time graph you've been noticing is staying relatively consistent without any large blips, except when we're changing scenes. Well, as you can see, these next gen games are starting to be a little bit of a struggle for the 2060 Super. The last game we're going to try is Fortnite, and we'll put it on DirectX 12 and ensure everything is maxed out. So nanite on, turn. We'll leave temporal anti-aliasing on. For the quality settings, we're going to have it on epic, temporal anti-aliasing on, nanites on, shadowing, lumen, all that stuff is on. So this is on Unreal Engine 5, so I do believe that it is going to be a struggle for the 2060 Super to keep up. Well, as you can see, the FPS isn't exactly the greatest with everything turned up to the max. This is based on Unreal Engine 5, which is very demanding when you have nanite and lumen and all those things turned on. The 2060 at this rate is struggling a little bit to put up half decent FPS. not horrible at an average of 37, but for a first player shooter like this, it's not the greatest. But after we're done this game, we'll try performance mode, see how well it performs there. It should do very well in performance mode. Well, before we try performance mode, let's turn things down a little bit. We'll go to the high presets. Let's try temporal super resolution on high as well. And hopefully we get a bit better frame rate. Yeah, turning down the presets and turning on TSR makes a huge difference. So this is completely playable at an average of 73 FPS with a 57 FPS 1% low. So we're quite a ways through the game now, and we're still maintaining a pretty high FPS. The average is 68, and the 1% low is 47. Really haven't noticed any major stuttering, even though the frame time graph is having a spiking up and down here and there. Go see if I can find someone to shoot. Someone must be right up ahead. All right, we're switched over to performance mode now. It's the settings. We should get pretty high FPS. I'm going to venture a guess that the 2060 Super is actually going to be bottlenecked just because of the high frame rates. Yeah, so as you can see, the FPS in performance mode is crazy high. It's so high, in fact, the 2060 Super is being bottlenecked. We're getting 500 FPS. Oddly enough, though, is one thing that just perturbs me with this game is the 1% low. There's enough frame time spikes that is driving the 1% low down considerably. So we have an average of 409, but the 1% low is 49. Hopefully as we play, maybe things will stabilize. Yeah, we've been playing for a bit now, and the 1% lows really haven't stabilized. There's quite a few little frame time spikes that are driving those 1% lows down. So we're ending around 1% low of 58 FPS, but the average is still pretty high at 400. And I think this has more to do with the game than it does the GPU, because as you see, when we went back and had DirectX 12 on with Nanite and everything, it was still doing pretty good. There's no excuse to have a 1% low of 60 FPS. Well, I think I've had enough of Fortnite. If you found this video helpful or useful, please think about subscribing to the channel, like the video. Have a good one.